Today we're going to start talking about the Great Depression. The Great Depression, of course, came directly after and somewhat of a result of the boom of the 1920s. During the 1920s, the president was Herbert Hoover, and he continued the policies of Coolidge of not interfering in the government and laissez-faire economic policies. He firmly believed that help by the federal government would not benefit America. He said that it would destroy the individuality. So as the country starts getting into the Depression, he's going to refuse welfare programs and not offer a whole lot of government assistance. He is going to look at implementing a tariff because he does consider the role of the government to be to manage foreign policy. A tariff is a way of increasing the price of foreign goods so that people don't buy foreign goods and instead buy domestic goods. It didn't really go the way he planned. So you need to know that at the beginning of the Great Depression, you have the continuation of a conservative economic policy, and then as the Depression worsens, you're going to get FDR, and he's going to implement a ton of government interventions in his first 100 days in office. He's going to implement the New Deal, which is a much more government intervention liberal policy towards dealing with the Depression. So we're going to look at both sides of this. And so we looked at the 1920s and everybody's buying. And in economics, you have what's called like a boom and bust. So people are buying in the 1920s. They're going to reach the amount that they can spend and max out their credit, and then that's when you have a recession or a decline. But in the 1920s, you had a bunch of other factors that are going to combine together to really, really deepen the Great Depression and cause it to be a Great Depression. So let's look at some of those factors. You've got economics, and we'll talk about that in detail. We're going to look at the stock market crash, banking systems, mass unemployment. We'll look at some of the problems that are going on in Europe, and then drought conditions. So all of these things are going to contribute to the Great Depression. So let's start with economics. Economics are sort of secular. If you ever take an economics class, you understand the way supply and demand work together in a capitalist or free market economy. The way a recession or a depression works is that something causes a decline in demand. And when there's a decline in demand, companies have an overproduction of goods, right? So if they have an overproduction of goods, they're going to lower the price of those goods, and they're going to stop producing because people aren't demanding their product, and they obviously only want to produce as much as people want or need. A lot of times this causes an income gap. The people at the top are making a lot of money, and when they see that their products are not being sold, they stop producing and then lay off workers, increasing that income gap because obviously people who aren't working don't have money. If they don't have a job or if they're being paid low wages, they can't even afford the products that maybe they're making, right? In the 1920s, this problem was compounded by the fact that a lot of people were buying things on credit or installment plans. So they reached not only their spending potential, but they reached their credit potential as well. So let's look at this sort of drop in spending leads to layoffs, and then no work leads to less money being spent. So you can see it's just a circle that keeps going around and around and around. And it's important to understand this as one of the causes for the Great Depression was simply a decline in demand, too many products, people being laid off, not having money, can't buy products, products can't be made. And around it goes. So a lot of students, when asked, well, what was the cause of the Great Depression, immediately you say, oh, the stock market crash or Black Tuesday. it definitely was a contributing factor, but it's more like a result of the economic problems. It wasn't the cause. Economics was a cause, and because of poor economics and policies of the Federal Reserve, Black Tuesday occurred, leading and deepening the Great Depression. So what is Black Tuesday? Black Tuesday was when the stock market lost its shareholding power dramatically. When you buy stock, you generally buy stock for the long term. So like if I were going to go buy a stock today, I would buy that stock for $10 and hold it for 30 years because I know that in 30 years it won't be worth $10, it'll be worth $20 or $30. Stock markets may go up and down in the days, but over years it always goes up. So stock markets are generally considered to be for long-term investing. But during the 1920s, with such massive production and growth, the stock market was booming. And so people were getting involved in the stock market not for the long term, but for the short term. They were getting involved to get quick fast. So when people wanted to buy stock, they again may not have had the money, so they would buy it on margin. And buying a margin is like buying on credit. They'd go to a broker and the broker would lend them money knowing that the stock would go up and they would get their money back. So they may buy a stock on Monday, but then turn around and sell it by Friday and they'd make a quick profit. Well, when Black Tuesday happened and the bottom fell out of the market, people who were holding loans for stock not only now had lost their money in the stock market, but they also couldn't pay back their loans. So that was a tremendous problem. When the stock market crashed, people went to the banks to get their money out because they were afraid of the stability of the economy. And they wanted to have money in hand. So you have to think about what money and banks were like back then, because they were much different than they are today. You may never even actually go into a bank. I very rarely do. My money comes out automatically on my debit card. My paycheck gets deposited directly. But in the Great Depression era, people actually used cash. You had to have that cash in hand to trade it for goods. And so you went to the bank, you took out your $30 that you might need for the week, and you needed it. You needed it in hand. So what happens when everyone goes to the bank at the exact same time? Well, you're going to have what's called a run on the bank. And you can see in this picture, everyone's trying to pull their money out. Well, if you understand the banking system or have had an economics course, you realize that banks don't hold your money in the vault. They invest it, right? You give them $100 and they take that money and they invest it with a business, and then the business pays them back on interest. Well, if everyone comes in to recall their money, they're not going to have the money to give out to you. Between 1930 and 1933, 10,000 banks are going to fail. People are going to go into the bank, try to withdraw their money, and then at the end of the day, some people are going to be told there's no more money. So people saw their savings just poof, go up in smoke. So there's going to be a mass withdrawing of money, which obviously means that people are not putting money into banks, right? And the economy needs people to put money into banks so that there can be investment going on. Banks did not have the regulations that they have today. For example, like the money wasn't guaranteed the way it is today. And we'll talk about that. Actually, money being guaranteed was something that came out of the New Deal. You do need to be aware of the Federal Reserve policy. In the 1920s, they had very low interest rates. They were encouraging people to make these risky investments in the stock market by offering really low interest. Well, when the stock market started to fall, they wanted to stop speculation, and so they jacked up interest rates, which is going to stop lending and stop investment. So this Federal Reserve's policy also dramatically hurt the economy. massive unemployment. The amount of jobs that were lost was just staggering. You had people wandering the streets with nowhere to live, no jobs were available. From these pictures, you can see these kids holding signs begging for jobs. Unemployment rate in 1933, which is sort of the height of the Great Depression, was at 25%. Just to give you a comparison, in 2008, when America was in our most recent recession, the unemployment rate was only at 7. So you can see that this really was a mind-boggling Great Depression, and when we say great, we really do mean. We do want to look a little bit at what the European debt situation was. We had arranged a reparation payment with Great Britain and France called the Dawes-Young Plan, and it was an interesting plan. But one of the main factors was that Great Britain and France were paying back us for military weapons, clothes, and food that we had given them during World War I. But in the 1920s, the economy was booming, so Germany, who was paying a lot of reparations to France and Great Britain, couldn't make their payments. So we began lending money to Germany. So we lent money to Germany. Germany paid France and Great Britain. Great Britain and France paid us. But it didn't really matter to us because we thought that we would get our money on the back end. But when the economy fell out, when the bottom fell out, of course, we stopped getting money. So no reparations, no repayments. European. We talked a little bit last time about how the farming community is going to start feeling the Great Depression before everyone else because they lose those international markets. They had to produce all of this food because we were feeding Europe, because Europe was at war. And to do this, they needed machinery. So they began borrowing money to buy this machinery to farm this land. Well, when the war was over and Europe begins making their own food, they don't need to buy food from America, the price of food drops dramatically because they have too much food, but they still owe the money on their machinery, so they start having to foreclose on their farms. Another interesting consideration what they were doing to the land if they continued to plant high demand crops on the soil, right? So they planted wheat after year, and it just devastated the soil. Areas that were once fertile to just become desert wastelands. And if you haven't looked at any of the pictures from the Dust Bowl, you should really take a look at it because it illustrates the extreme weather conditions that were happening in places that we depended on for food. So you've got this economic situation of people reaching their potential buying power, and they're making risky speculations in the stock market, and the stock market bursts, causing a run on the bank. People lose their savings, they lose their money for investment, businesses start closing, businesses are closing, they're losing your job, they can't buy more goods. So it's sort of a snowball effect that causes the Great Depression. Hearing all over the United States. Central Park in New York just becomes inundated with people living out of basically like cardboard boxes. And these shanty towns become known as Hoovervilles. So that kind of helps you remember who was president and the terrible economic situation that was going on. An interesting thing that happened was something called the bonus army. During World War I, veterans were issued certificates that they could redeem in 1945 and get a bonus for World War I. Well, they wanted to get this bonus money early, and They marched to Washington. There were close to like 15,000 people, and they, sat on the steps, and they demanded Hoover to give them their bonus before 1945. And Hoover refused to see them, and they did get attention from Congress, and Congress, debated about what to do, and then Congress said, no, we're not going to pay you your bonus. So some people went home, but then others just stayed. They had nowhere to go. They had no jobs. Their houses had been foreclosed on, so they just stayed. And Hoover's going to see these people who are setting up camp and living across the pond in front of Washington as a national security threat. So he's going to send in policemen, and he's going to send in General Douglas MacArthur with cavalry and tanks to remove them. So here's a picture. You can see this the Washington's in the background, and here are these people that they're just camped out. They have no jobs, no place to go. And so Hoover sends in the troops. Well, you can imagine this did nothing to increase Hoover's likability. Not willing to help, not willing to pay veterans, and he, of course, is not reelected. So FDR is elected to hopefully pull us out of the Great Depression, and he's going to look at something called relief, recover, reform, or the 3 R's. Those are his goals, right? And his first 100 days in office, he's going to start passing lots of legislation to do this. And a lot of people call it the alphabet soup of FDR. FDIC, the SEC, the AAA, the TVA, the CCC, the WPA, and it goes on and on and on. All of these acronyms are for different organizations and different things that he did to provide that relief, recovery, and reform so needed during the Great Depression. You don't have to know all of them. It would be very difficult to know all of them. So we want to look at the ones. Of course, the first thing you want to look at is the Emergency Banking Act, because the banks, of course, are under extreme stress, and they're a very important part of our economy. So he declares a bank holiday and suspends the people's ability to take out money. The other thing he does for banks is he guarantees your money. So if you've ever been to a bank and gone in, and you might see it's a black plaque with gold lettering and it says FDIC, it means that your money is guaranteed up to a certain amount by the federal government. So you don't have to worry about going in and trying to get money out and there not being any money. And that's a big thing, so that people have faith in the American banking system again and start putting their money back in the bank. And that's huge. Of course, he's going to start trying to provide jobs for people. And remember, Hoover's idea was that it's not the government's place to create jobs, right? He didn't want to create a welfare state. FDR is not afraid to give money to the states to create jobs, from the federal government to create jobs. He's going to create the WPA. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Association, is going to go into Tennessee and start putting up lighting to rural areas. They're going to work on bridges and roads and also and maintenance stuff for the part of the United States infrastructure. Of course, farming, we talked about how the farming was just bottomed out, and the president's going to go in and start working to stabilize food prices by giving farmers subsidies. So he would pay people to farm particular foods, and maybe even not to farm particular goods, because he wanted to level out food prices. The big thing, of course, is Social Security. That's the really big one, right? If you have a job, you will probably notice on your paycheck that part of it is taken out for Social Security. Before this, if you were to get old and you hadn't saved, you were in a lot of trouble. If you didn't save, there was no savings for you. So what the Social Security Act did is it said that the government would take out money from your paycheck and save it for you for when you were older, to guarantee that you had money when you were older. Of course, it all comes out of everyone's paycheck. This is a lot of government intervention, and this is it's much, much more government interference than the American people are used to. So FDR did an excellent job of communicating to people what he was doing, and he did this by using radio, what he called his fireside chats. And it really went into people's homes,
the President of the United States,
in what he was doing, and it gave them hope, and they really were a remarkable thing.
I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days, and why it was done, and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations, and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning around. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is wholly sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country. What then happened during the last few days of February and the first few days of March? Because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand. The reason for this was that on the spur of the moment it is of course impossible to sell perfectly sound assets of a bank and convert them into cash except at panic prices far below their real value. By the afternoon of March 3rd, a week ago last Friday, scarcely a bank in the country was open to do business. Proclamations closing them in whole or in part had been issued by the governors in almost all the states. It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the National Bank holiday, and this was the first step in the government reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric.
Had been issued by the governors in almost all
last
the
Thursday
states.
Was the legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible in view of the requirement of time to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation of our banking facilities. And I want to tell our citizens in every part of the nation that the National Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, showed by this action a devotion to public welfare and a realization of the emergency and the necessity for speed that it is difficult to match in all our history. The third stage has been the series of regulations permitting the banks to continue their function to take care of the distribution of food and household necessities and the payment of payroll. This bank holiday while resulting in many
The
cases
third
in great
stage has been the
inconvenience,
series of
is
regulations
affording us the
permitting the
opportunity to
banks to
supply the
continue their
currency
function,
necessary to
to
meet
take
the
care of
situation.
the distribution of
Remember
food,
that no
of household
sound bank is
necessities,
a dollar
and
worse
the payment
off
of payroll.
than it was when it closed its doors last
This
week.
bank holiday,
Neither
while
is any
resulting
bank
in many
which
cases
may
of great
turn out not
inconvenience,
to be
is
in a
affording
position
us the
for immediate
opportunity
opening.
to supply the
The
currency
new law
necessary to
allows
meet
the
the
12
situation.
Federal Reserve Banks
Remember that
to
no
issue
sound
additional
bank is a
currency
dollar
on good
worse
assets,
off than
and
it
thus
was
the
when it
banks
closed
that
its doors
reopen will
last
be
week.
able to meet every
Neither is
legitimate
any
cause.
bank which may
The new
turn out
currency
not
is
to
being
be
sent out
in
by the
a
Bureau of
position for
Engraving and
immediate
Printing
opening.
in
The
large
new
volume
law
to every
allows the
part of
12
the country.
Federal Reserve Banks
It is sound
to
currency
issue additional
because it is
currency
backed
on good
by
assets,
actual good
and
assets.
thus the banks that reopen will
Another
be able
question
to
that
meet
you will ask
every
is this:
legitimate call.
why are all
The
the
new
banks not
currency
to be
is being
reopened
sent
at the
out
same
by the
time?
Bureau of Engraving and
The
Printing
answer is simple,
in
and I
large
know you'll
volume to
understand it.
every part of the
Your
country.
government does not
is sound
intend that the
So
history
what
of
you
the
can
past few
see in
years
these
shall be repeated.
fireside chats
We do not
that
want
went into
and will
every
not have
home over the
another
radio
epidemic of bank
and were
failure.
listened to intently
As a result,
by
we start
by
tomorrow,
almost
Monday,
all
with the
Americans,
opening of
was that
banks
he's
in the
reassuring
12
and he's
Federal
laying out his
Reserve bank
plan
cities.
and he's telling them
Those
exactly
banks
what he's
which on
doing.
first
He has a
examination by
warm
the
voice. I
Treasury
wish I spoke as
have already
eloquently
been
as he
found to
does.
be all right.
He's telling them,
That will be followed on Tuesday
this is what we're doing,
by the
and it was
resumption
very
of all
effective.
other functions
Over
by
the
banks
course of the
already
years, he will
found to
do
be sound
30
in
fireside
cities
chats.
where there are recognized clearinghouses. That means about 250 cities of the United States. In other words, we're moving as fast as the mechanics of the situation will allow us. On Wednesday and succeeding days, banks in smaller places all through the country will resume business, subject, of course, to the government's physical ability to complete its survey. It is necessary that the reopening of banks be extended over a period in order to permit the banks to make applications for the necessary loans, to obtain currency needed to meet their requirements, and to enable the government to make common sense checkups. Please let me make it clear to you that if your bank does not open the first day, you are by no means justified in believing that it will not open. A bank that opens on one of the subsequent days is in exactly the same status as the bank that opens tomorrow. I know that many people are worrying about state banks that are not members of the Federal Reserve System. There is no occasion for that worry. These banks can and will receive assistance from member banks and from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And of course, they are under the immediate control of the state banking authorities. These state banks are following the same course as the national banks, except that they get their licenses to resume business from the state authorities. And these authorities have been asked by the Secretary of the Treasury to permit their good banks to open up on the same schedule as the national banks. And so I am confident that the state banking departments will be as careful as the national government in the policy relating to the opening of banks and will follow the same broad theories. It is possible that when the banks resume, a very few people who have not recovered from their fear may again begin withdrawals. Let me make it clear to you that the banks will take care of all needs, except, of course, the hysterical demands of hoarders. And it is my belief that hoarding during the past week has become an exceedingly unfashionable pastime in every part of our nation. It needs no prophet to tell you that when the people find that they can get their money, that they can get it when they want it for all legitimate purposes, the phantom of fear will soon be laid. People will again be glad to have their money where it will be safely taken care of and where they can use it conveniently at any time. I can assure you, my friends, that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than it is to keep it under the mattress. The success of our whole national program depends, of course, on the cooperation of the public, on its intelligent support, and its use of a reliable system. Remember that the essential accomplishment of the new legislation
So I picked that one because it definitely shows that he's expanding the government's power, right? The executive branch is getting involved in banking for the first time, and they're issuing a banking holiday. And not everyone is going to think that this expansion of the executive branch is a good thing, especially the Supreme Court. They're going to think that it's overreaching on the part of the president, expanding the president's power, and of course, violating a lot of the Constitution. So you see in this cartoon the hand of FDR pushing through the Constitution and smushing the Supreme Court. Because if you have a government class, you realize that it's the Supreme Court's job to check the powers of the president. And they do that by saying that the laws he's passed are unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court starts looking at doing away with some of his New Deal proposals. So FDR is coming into conflict with the conservative Supreme Court. So he starts looking at ways to make the court more liberal and help get some of his New Deal through. He started offering full retirement to sitting judges. He offered to expand the court to 15 judges, saying y'all are getting kind of old, maybe you need some help. Because remember, judges are appointed for life. And if you expand the court, of course, the president gets to appoint a judge, and then he would, of course, appoint a liberal judge. They didn't do this. They did come to some compromise, and the Supreme Court kept its integrity while working with the president to get the important parts of his New Deal pushed through. So you do need to be aware of that there is, again, this liberal versus conservative. The liberals are going to consider the New Deal not to be enough, right? Especially for women and minorities. African Americans were often to be the first fired and the last hired. And then women who were doing jobs that men were doing often got paid a lot less. So liberals wanted FDR to get involved in civil rights action to get more African Americans hired, and of course to work to get equal pay for minorities and women. Conservatives are going to believe that FDR is going too far. He's overreaching. He's getting involved in economics and business and private sector in ways that it had never done before. There was too much interference. Remember this, the implementing of sort of a communist or of a socialist state. So you need to be aware that there are two sides to everything. So we want to look, and the last thing, we're sort of done with the Great Depression. We're going to look in next time at what brought us out of the Great Depression. And of course, most historians agree that it would be the spending of World War II. So we're going to start at World War II. But let's end with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the wife of FDR, and she's a very remarkable lady. She's going to transform the role of the First Lady. Before Eleanor, the First Lady, basically, she would hold parties, hold dinners, a very sort of a tertiary role. But Eleanor wasn't like that. She didn't sit back. She was a champion for women's rights and minority rights, and she flew all over giving speeches, especially when her husband had polio and he couldn't travel. She would go and she would give the speeches and get the information and then go back to her husband and report on what she found. After her husband's death, she thought that she might step out of the spotlight from politics, but was asked to serve as the UN's first delegate. So she served as a delegate to the UN. It's important to note this because all women first ladies who came after her sort of stand on Eleanor's shoulders. If you think about Hillary Clinton, who got involved in politics when her husband Bill was in office, and now she herself may be running for president in 2016. Or Michelle Obama, who has her own health initiatives and is trying to work to make America more healthy. All of this comes because Eleanor pushed the envelope in getting women in the spotlight, even in politics. And that today, if you want to look at some of the other sources that I use for this lesson, you can definitely do that.